Well, hi everybody, welcome. Very happy to have you all here. Thank you for joining on a Thursday evening. I know a lot of your names, but not all of your names. So for anyone I haven't met, my name is Eleanor Harris. I am one of the co-directors here at the Clifton Institute. My husband and co-director, Bert Harris, is also on the call. So again, yeah, we'll be trying to kind of keep an eye on the chat. Please let us know if you have any problems, but also please let us know if you have any questions or comments as we go. And again, for anyone who doesn't know us or doesn't know me, the Clifton Institute, welcome. This is a little bit of an unusual program for us. Most of our programs are in person. I'm actually not even at Clifton right now. I'm in my home. So most of our programs are at the Clifton Institute property. We have a big, beautiful 900-acre nature preserve that we use for education programs. So we're trying to teach people, adults and children, about the native plants and animals of Virginia and what we can do to take care of them. We are trying to manage that property as good habitat for all sorts of different native plants and animals and spread the word to landowners in the area about best land management practices. And then we're doing a lot of scientific research to inform that advice. We're trying to figure out what we can do to especially manage land for declining species. So the last couple of years we've been focusing on American kestrels and box turtles and trying to figure out what kind of habitats those species need and how best land can be managed to support them. So please come out and join us. It's a lot more fun to be in person, but I thought we would do it this way to reach a few more people. But please come and join us on an in-person walk sometime soon. So tonight, as you all know, I'm going to be telling you about 5 lessons that we can learn from plants. And really, as I started working on this talk, it turned into more like 7, let me see, there we go, 7 lessons that we can learn from plants. And really what I wanted this to be is kind of a Botany 101. And this really stems from all those in-person programs that we're doing. So both from me learning from other people as I'm out there learning about plants, I still have a lot to learn about plants, but also while I'm leading walks, there have been I've kind of been working on a list of common misconceptions that either I had or that I see a lot of other people have that I wanted to take some time to clear up and also give plants a little bit more of the love they deserve. I think animals get a lot of attention for how showy and impressive and amazing they are to watch, but plants are doing some really amazing stuff too. So I wanted to give plants a little love and attention. So my plan for the evening to kind of go through the topics I'm going to cover, I'm going to start with kind of what makes a plant a plant. Then I am going to run through the evolution of plants on Earth in very few minutes. And then I will finish with a focus on flowering plants, the most diverse plants on Earth. And as we do that, I hope I will convey 7 lessons that I think we can learn from plants, which are as follows, to kind of give a spoiler alert for what's coming ahead. The lessons are: to each their own, small and steady wins the race, invest wisely, it's okay to ask for help, be creative, we can always keep on growing, and use what you've got. And I also like to start with just other ideas about ways to learn more about plants, especially some of the books that I have enjoyed learning from. And these are some of my favorites. So Botany in a Day is a great one, especially if you're learning to identify plant families. That's a great place to start. This botany textbook I have loved. I don't have any formal education in botany, and so kind of browsing and learning from this book has been a really great source of education for me. And then field guides are always really great resources, and these are some that I really enjoy. There's a nice fruit key and twig key. A fern book just came out last year. That was a big development for our area. We have a nice new field guide for ferns, so if you're interested in that group of plants, would highly recommend it. And I'm going to talk a bit about trees, and this is a great one. The Sibley Guide to Trees also came out in the last few years or so, a great resource for learning more. Okay, so let's start with what is a plant. This could be a very long list, but there are a few things that I think we often think about when we're thinking about plants. And so they are usually green, except when they're not. For example, this ghost pipe that we can see right here in Virginia has lost its chlorophyll and is white instead of green. Another thing we often think about with plants is that they are stuck in place. They do not move, except, of course, when they do. So something like this Venus flytrap has the ability to move its leaves to capture its prey. So there are exceptions to that rule too. They usually have leaves, again, except when they don't. So this cactus has modified all of its leaves to turn into those spiky spines that is protecting its pads from predators. And so there are exceptions even to the idea that plants have leaves. If you put a plant under a microscope, which is hard to do, you would probably see rigid cell walls, but that definition I don't think does most of us kind of casual plant observers much good. So really what the special thing that sets plants apart is that they are able to do something called photosynthesis. So we as animals, as all other animals, need to consume other things to get food, to get the nutrients we need to keep our bodies going. So we're either eating plants and or other animals. Plants are able to make their own food through photosynthesis, which is a really incredible thing that they are able to do. And the basic idea of photosynthesis is that they take carbon dioxide in the air, sunlight, water, they are able to turn that into sugar and oxygen that we then get to breathe in. So thanks very much, plants, for doing that for us. And they are able to do that with a molecule called chlorophyll, which has a nice special ability to take in sunlight, generate energy that then is turned into sugar and oxygen. And the chlorophyll in plants is usually organized in chloroplasts, as in this microscope slide here. And that's what makes plants green. Let's see, I'm seeing someone that's saying the slides. Bert, are you there? It's blurry, okay. In that case, let me try, thank you for letting me know. Let me try a different method. Thought I would try something fancy and slick tonight, but I should have stuck to what I know. Does that look better, Bert? Okay, great. Here we go. Thank you for letting me know. Please let me know if there's anything else going wrong. Great, thank you. Okay, so we've got chlorophyll doing the special thing, making plants green. And so when you read about photosynthesis, the kind of simple summary of photosynthesis is that it is how plants are able to make their own food. But photosynthesis just makes sugar. And so as I've been learning more about photosynthesis, I got curious about why that's enough for plants, why this idea of photosynthesis making sugar is considered making food for plants. And I'm most familiar with my own nutritional needs, the food that I need to eat as an animal. And so I could think about my nice complete breakfast. Maybe I've got some toast with some butter, some eggs, and some orange juice. And that would cover basically the major types of nutrients that I need to put in my body. And so the big three types of nutrients, they're called macronutrients, these big categories of food that animals need to put in their bodies are carbohydrates. So you can get that from bread and rice and all sorts of other grains and starches. And we need carbohydrate for energy. So all the movements that you are doing are fueled by carbohydrates. We also need fat. We need to consume a lot of fat in the form of butter or olive oil or avocados, wherever it might be. And we use fats for a few different reasons. So if you eat too many carbohydrates, some of that excess energy is going to get stored for later. So if we have a really nice year now, maybe we'll have a lean year next year, and all that energy can be stored in fat. So that's a great thing animals can do. And we also need a lot of fat just to keep our bodies warm and safe. So we're trying to keep our bodies at 98.6 degrees. And the only way that we're able to do that is insulating fat all over the place. And we also have all these squishy organs in our bodies, which are very delicate, very fragile, very important. And we use fat to kind of cushion all those organs from getting squished or damaged. So it's really important that we have enough fat to keep our animal bodies safe. We also need to eat a lot of proteins in the form of eggs or meats or beans, all sorts of different ways we can get protein. And we use those to grow and repair our muscles and our bones and to make hormones and enzymes that we use for all sorts of different processes. And then finally, we need a small amount of vitamins just to keep things going the way they should. And plants need basically the same types of nutrients, but in different amounts, and they get them different ways. So plants also need carbohydrates, sugars, and that's what they're getting through photosynthesis. So they are able to make this huge category of their food through photosynthesis. Plants do need fats as well. A lot of times plants will kind of provision their seeds with fat so that they are ready to germinate. And so they need fats to make seeds, a few other purposes, but they don't need as much fat as we do. And they can make all the fats they need for themselves from the sugars from photosynthesis. They need, again, a small amount of protein, not as much as we do. They use that for hormones and enzymes as well. And again, they can make that for themselves. And then finally, just like us, they need a small amount of vitamins to keep all their systems running. And they get those right through their roots. And so it's similar requirements that plants and animals have in different amounts, and plants are able to basically get everything on their own. So they're very, very, very self-sufficient, and it's, in terms of an animal, really a superpower, as independent as they are able to be. So that is the first lesson of the evening. To each their own. We have different requirements. Scrambled eggs and toast might sound great to me. Plants are pretty much happy on sunlight and air, which is amazing. So photosynthesis is this plant superpower, or is it? I do want to just mention an animal briefly, because here in Virginia, it is vernal pool season. We have been seeing at Clifton, the salamanders starting to come out and breed in our ephemeral pools and our vernal pools, including this beautiful guy, this beautiful amphibian, the spotted salamander. And so this is an adult spotted salamander, and these are its eggs, which you can see are a little bit green colored. So spotted salamanders are the only vertebrate animals that are known to be able to harness the power of photosynthesis for their own good. And the way they do that is that they kind of almost allow algae to colonize their eggs, which gives this green color. And the embryos are able to use some of the oxygen from the algae's photosynthesis to help them grow. So it's a really incredible kind of symbiosis between spotted salamanders and algae. So if you go out in vernal pools this time of year, go out and check out pools near you. And if you see green eggs, that's what's going on. So here's kind of our checklist of what a plant is. They're usually green, they usually don't move, they usually have leaves, they have rigid cell walls, they do photosynthesis. So what other things, are there other things that satisfy those requirements? So sometimes you're walking through the woods, you'll see something like a mushroom. It's very easily confused with a plant. Fungi, mushrooms, are not plants because they cannot photosynthesize. They cannot make their own food. They need to eat rotting organic matter to survive. So fungi are actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants, despite their kind of superficial similarities. Lichens are also very easily confused for plants. You're walking around, you see this kind of fuzzy green stuff. Looks an awful lot like a plant. Lichens are very complex, kind of cooperation between fungi and algae. Algae gets moved around taxonomically every few years. I think currently it is considered a plant, but the fungi part of lichens is not. So we wouldn't consider lichens a plant. Moss is another small green fuzzy thing you can see walking around the woods. Is moss a lichen? Is it a fungus? Is it a plant? What is it? Mosses are considered true plants, and they come in all this amazing diversity of shape and form. And in fact, mosses were the first plants on land. And because of that, they've retained this very simple, ancestral, ancient way of life, including the fact that they don't have any vascular systems. So they don't have any tubes to move water and nutrients around. And because of that, they rely on diffusion. So they rely on water just kind of moving around where it's following a concentration gradient. And that can't happen over large distances, so mosses can't get very big. So they've kind of gotten stuck at a pretty small size. And in fact, the biggest moss in the world, which is a species called Dawsonia superba, which can be found in Malaysia, New Zealand, New Guinea, that part of the world, is only 2 feet tall. So that is the biggest moss on the planet. And so that is the second lesson that I think we can learn from plants, is that small and steady wins the race. Mosses have been around hundreds of millions of years. They are very successful. They have lasted a long time, and they are doing just fine with a very small life very small life form. They stay small because they don't have tubes, and they've looked that way for a very, very long time. So like I said, they were the first plants that came out on land over 400 million years ago. So this is the start of the evolutionary history of plants on land. So the next big development was the arrival of the club moss. That happened about 410 million years ago. We still have club mosses today. You can go out in forests all over Virginia, all over the country, see things like ground pine. It looks like this. It's quite small. And the big exciting development of club mosses were they were the first plants to have vascular systems that allowed them to move water and nutrients around. The next big development in land plants was the arrival of ferns about 360 million years ago. And they just have a more complex growth form than club mosses do. So today, both club mosses and ferns are pretty small. There are ferns that are meters tall, but not as big as a tree. But hundreds of millions of years ago, there were forests made up of giant club mosses and ferns. So these groups are not restricted in size by any physical constraints. They have just kind of gotten stuck now as a small size, but we used to have forests full of these huge club mosses and ferns, which is just incredible to think about. And then the next big step in the evolution of plants was the arrival of seeds in a group of plants called gymnosperms, which includes things like this Table Mountain pine cone. And that actually happened at a similar time to the arrival of ferns. So the arrival of seeds with the gymnosperms was a big deal. So I want to explain why seeds are so important, why that was such a big innovation. And to do that, I think it helps again to kind of think about our human body and how we reproduce. So as human adults, as anything, well, as human beings, let's say as our human being bodies, we have 23 chromosomes, but we have 2 copies of each of those chromosomes in all of the cells of our body. So we have 23 chromosomes, 2 copies. That means we have 46 chromosomes in all of the cells of our body. But the way we got there is with a sperm and an egg that each only had half of that genetic material. So a sperm from our father had 1 copy of each of the 23 chromosomes. An egg from our mother also had only 1 copy of those 23 chromosomes. They came together to form a fertilized egg that had 2 copies, the kind of full complement of genetic material. And so it is with the seed plants. So if we think about something like a white pine tree, it has male pine cones that look like this, and they are full of pollen, which is the plant's kind of equivalent of sperm. The white pine tree also has female pine cones that look like this, and under all of those scales at the beginning of the pine cone's life are pine cone eggs, which is their version of a human egg. And the pollen and the egg come together to form a fertilized seed, which is shown here. So these are the fertilized seeds of a white pine cone that result from the union of pollen and egg. And then that seed might get planted, hopefully it gets planted and grows into a beautiful white pine tree. And so the life cycle of the pine tree is that you have this pine tree that makes, again, the female and the male cones. They come together to make seeds. The seed gets planted, grows into a new white pine. This is completely different from how mosses and ferns were reproducing before gymnosperms got on the scene. And so this is how mosses are making their life. So first of all, they are using something called spores. And the major difference between spores and seeds is just how tiny they are. So this is a capsule of a moss. So that capsule might be not even a half an inch big. And then it's spewing out this microscopic powder of spores. And when that spore lands somewhere on fertile ground, it grows into what we know of, what we think of as the moss plant, this little leafy stem. But the spore only had half of the genetic material. It only has half of the number of chromosomes it needs. So each of these little stems that we think of as kind of adult mosses are really only half of a moss. So these 2 little leafy stems will exchange sperm and egg. They will fertilize each other, and only then do they have the full complement, the whole 2 sets of chromosomes that is considered kind of an adult plant, which looks like this little stalk that grows out of the leafy stem. And at the top of that is a little capsule that spews out spores, and then the cycle starts all over again. So these 2 life cycles are completely different. And the major differences between spores and seeds are that spores are teeny, teeny, tiny, microscopic, can barely be seen by the human eye. Seeds are macroscopic, very easy for us to see and to pick up and to plant. Spores only have half of the genetic material of the plant. Seeds have the full genetic material, both full sets of copies of the chromosomes that's required to make a new plant. The spores don't have any provision for when they land. They are kind of on their own. Seeds, on the other hand, have been provisioned with some fats and proteins that make it easy for the seed to germinate and grow into a little baby plant. And so this kind of taking care of their seeds, giving them some food, giving them some nutrients so they are ready to go, they're taken care of when they start off in a new place, is what has made seeds so successful. And at this point on planet Earth, most of the plants are seed plants rather than reproducing with spores. And so the third lesson I think we can learn from plants is that it is a good idea to invest wisely. And plants do that by providing their seeds with the protection and nutrients that their seeds need to grow. And for pretty much the rest of the evening, I am going to be sticking to seed plants because they are so much more diverse and just we're more familiar and comfortable with seed plants. So we started with mosses. The next step was club mosses. The next step was ferns, then gymnosperms like this pine tree. And then the last big innovation in the evolution of plants on Earth was the arrival of flowering plants around 135 million years ago. So relatively recently in kind of the entire span of plants on Earth. And scientifically, we call flowering plants angiosperms. And so the major differences between gymnosperms and angiosperms are how they take care of their seeds. So gymnosperm means naked seed. And you can remember that by remembering the word gymnasium, which is where the ancient Greeks would go to do their gymnastics, which were their naked exercises. That is where the word gymnastics and gymnasium comes from. And similar here, gymnosperm means naked seed. So you can see in this picture of a pine cone, the little kind of deer hoof looking things are the pine cone seeds that are just hanging out in the wind with very little protection. Angiosperms, or flowering plants on the other hand, means contained seeds. So when they make their seeds, they also pad them with these big fleshy containers. So this is a picture of a pawpaw cut in half that has all this really fatty, soft, nutritious flesh all around the seeds protecting them. And so these are the 2 main kinds of seed plants that we have currently on Earth. So we've got the gymnosperm, so that's things like pine cones and hemlocks, anything with needles. And then on the other hand, we have flowering plants. Sometimes we kind of confuse the words conifers and gymnosperms. So conifers is all those things with with cones, pines and hemlocks and spruces and all those plants, all those trees. Conifers are the vast majority of gymnosperms, but there are a few oddballs that aren't strictly conifers. So things like cycads are gymnosperms that are not conifers. Yes, that's right. The other 2 big categories of plants that we hear bandied around a lot are evergreen and deciduous. So evergreen are plants that hang onto their leaves all year long. They have green leaves or needles all year long. Deciduous plants turn colors in the fall, lose their leaves, and then start over with a new set of leaves next year. And we often use evergreen and gymnosperm kind of synonymously, and most gymnosperms are evergreen. So pine trees hang onto their needles all year long, but they aren't really strictly the same. And there are gymnosperms that are deciduous. So for example, the larch or the tamarack has needles, it has cones. So biologically, it is a gymnosperm, but it turns this beautiful yellow color in the fall and loses its needles and then starts over with a new batch in the spring. And then conversely, I think when we think about flowering plants, we often think of deciduous plants that are going to start over in the spring. And there is a really large overlap between flowering plants and deciduous plants. But there are things like rhododendrons that have flowers, so they are biologically flowering plants. But they have leaves, they have green leaves all year long. So they are strictly evergreen. And so all four of these words are perfectly valid ways to describe a plant. But gymnosperms and angiosperms reflect very deep evolutionary differences and differences in how they reproduce. And evergreen and deciduous just reflect differences in what they do with their leaves year to year. And so they're not kind of synonymous, and it's good to be careful about which words you are using. But really, I want to focus on flowering plants because they are the plants that took over the world. So this is the number of species that we have on Earth now. There are about 3,000 mosses, a couple thousand gymnosperms, and over 300,000 species of flowering plants. So they are hugely diverse. The vast, vast, vast majority of plants that we see around us today are flowering plants. And that has to do with those, with their beautiful flowers. So if we go back to gymnosperms, they do something called anemophily. So that means wind loving. And so what that means is that they are wind pollinated. They shoot their pollen out, hope that it catches the wind, hope that the wind carries it to a female cone, gets it where it needs to go. And so they are shooting out huge numbers of pollen spores, crossing their fingers, hoping for the best. Flowers figured out a really clever strategy, which was to attract animal pollinators. And the scientific word, if we're, it's fun to learn some new words, and anemophily is one, zoophily is another. So zoophily just means that they rely on animals to pollinate them. We think the earliest flowering plants looked something like this magnolia, who developed these beautiful petals, beautiful smells to attract animals to come and pick up pollen and bring it to another flower, which is a much more reliable strategy than just hoping the wind is going to take your pollen where it needs to go. And of course, this is how flowers still reproduce today. Here are some coral hairstreak from Clifton picking up pollen from this beautiful butterfly milkweed that they're going to go and take it on where it needs to go. And because flowers have more reliable pollination, and because they have formed specialized relationships with insects and other types of animals, they have diversified into all sorts of different shapes and colors and forms, like this very, very small sample of flowering plants that we can find here in Virginia. And so all of these beautiful petals that come in all sorts of different shapes and colors have all evolved to attract different animal pollinators who are then responsible for their incredible speciation. Conversely, that was a great boon for their animal pollinating partners. There is a hypothesis that beetles were able to radiate speciate as rapidly and amazingly as they were because of their partnership with plants. So as flowering plants were specializing on insects, insects were then specializing on flowering plants. The flowering plants were able to speciate, the beetles were able to speciate. There are about 400,000 species of beetles on planet Earth, and that might be thanks to the arrival of flowering plants. And so this is just a small sample of beetles that even can be found right here in Virginia, let alone all over the world. It is an incredibly diverse and interesting group of insects that are starting to come out right now. So it's going to be exciting as we go into summer to try to go out and look for a lot of these guys. So I think that's the fourth lesson that we can learn from plants, which is that it is okay to ask for help. The success of flowers has a lot to do with the fact that they were able to enlist the help of animal pollinators to help them reproduce. And so through those 5 groups, we have kind of come to the end of the list of major groups of plants. And I find that a useful framework when I am walking around the woods looking at a plant that I'm kind of unfamiliar with, because it gives me kind of the options for what kind of plants I'm looking at and what reproductive strategy they might be using. Because every plant on Earth must have some way of reproducing itself. Otherwise, it would have gone extinct long ago. And so that kind of narrows down our options. If it looks a little bit mossy or ferny, it probably uses spores. If it looks like a pine tree or a cedar tree, something with needles, something with cones, it probably uses cones to reproduce. And if it's not one of those two things, then it probably has flowers, even if the flowers are really inconspicuous or we don't think of that plant as having flowers. So if you go out and you see something like this magnificent white oak, I think this is a champion white oak from Massachusetts, you might not think about a white oak as being a flowering plant, but it's sure not a moss, sure not a pine tree, so it must be a flowering plant. And that's the only way that it is able to make the nut that we all associate with oaks, which are acorns. And when a flowering plant reproduces, it makes fruit. So fruit is just the botanical word for any structure that contains seeds in a flowering plant. And of course, there are some fruits that we are very familiar with, the fruits that we pack in our lunchbox every day, like apples and strawberries. These are the results of flowering plants. There are a lot of fruits that if you know any third graders, they might really delight in telling you that a tomato is actually a fruit, not a vegetable. These are things that are considered vegetables in the kitchen, but they are seed-bearing structures. Peppers and tomatoes and peas and zucchini and all the best vegetables are botanically fruit because they contain seeds. And then there are some things that are even harder to consider fruits, but are botanically considered fruits. So things like this acorn, that's a nut, that's a seed, that structure is considered a fruit. Or when it comes around to late summer and the milkweed has bloomed and created these really amazing spiky pods, those pods contain seeds. So that milkweed pod is technically considered a fruit. So I don't think this is a life lesson so much as just a really important lesson in botany. If you learn nothing else tonight, I'd like you to go away with the lesson that fruits come from flowers. Any structure that we see around us that has seeds that's not on a pine tree must have come from a flower. So come September, if you see this pawpaw fruit, you can remember that it came from a pawpaw flower earlier in the summer. Or in the fall, you're walking around and you find an acorn. That is a fruit that came from an oak flower. And the flip side of that is that flowers turn into fruits. That is their job, to turn into fruits. So if you're walking around a garden and you see a beautiful iris, it's not there just to look pretty. Its goal is to turn into a fruit. And in the case of an iris, it looks like this little green seed pod. And again, that milkweed that we all enjoy attracting butterflies so much in the summer is going to turn into the fruit of a seed pod late in the summer. So again, the goal of a flower is not to look pretty for our eyes, is not to give honey to bees. The goal of a flower is to get pollinated so that it can create seeds to create more plants. And plants have figured out so many different ways to accomplish that goal. So again, we have this butterfly milkweed with these coral hair streaks. They're going to come and pick some pollen up and hopefully bring it to another butterfly milkweed. That is an amazing partnership, but all things considered, a pretty simple system. They just come pick up some pollen, move it somewhere else. There are all sorts of really, really interesting ways that flowers have figured out of moving their pollen around. And so here are just a few that I wanted to highlight. So the cardinal flower is a really interesting one. All these really beautiful red petals are actually not petals. There are leaves that have been co-opted to look like petals. And then the other interesting thing that it does is that it makes a tube out of its petals and then first sticks a little bearded anther out with its pollen. And then when it's done with that, it will stick a pistil out of the same tube. And so it has made these really complex structures to kind of sequentially put out pollen and then eventually put out the pistil to avoid pollinating itself. A really weird flower that, again, can be found right here in Virginia is the hog peanut. So this is a member of the pea family. This is what its flowers look like. These flowers can get pollinated. the plant is actually not even relying on these flowers at all. It has secret underground flowers that it will pollinate itself that will turn into the peanuts that give this plant its name. So it's almost kind of given up on its showy flowers and created a kind of a secret underground system of flowers that are much harder to see. Orchids have done a complete kind of reorganization of their flowers. So most flowers have stamens and pistils that provide the pollen and the eggs. Orchids have combined those structures into a single object, a single structure called a column. So in a couple of weeks, we're very excitedly waiting for the showy orchids to come up. You can look carefully at the inside of one of these flowers, and they have structures that aren't really found in any other groups of flowers. One of my favorite plants is also going to be coming up in the next few weeks, and that's wild ginger. And it makes these beautiful maroon kind of barrel-shaped flowers that it hides under the leaf litter, waiting for not bees or butterflies, the insects that we think of as common pollinators, but ants. It's waiting for ants to kind of come along and walk into one of these bells, pick up some pollen, and then move it to another flower. Which brings me to my favorite type of flower, which are stinky red ones. There's this whole suite of flowers out there that have kind of convergently settled on this strategy of having stinky flowers that smell like rotting meat or yeast or fermenting things and look red, again, maybe like rotting meat. And they are, again, not interested in bees or butterflies, the friendly pollinators we're more familiar with, but kind of the more metal pollinators, the flies and the beetles who are going to be attracted to things that smell kind of gross to our nose. And so here are just a few examples. Stinking Benjamin is this really beautiful trillium, smells pretty bad, looking for those flies and beetles to come and pollinate it. Pawpaw, again, should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. Go smell a pawpaw. People say it smells a little bit like beer, a little bit like rotting meat, a really, really amazing smell. It's hoping for flies and beetles to come and pollinate it. Skunk cabbage, it should be out just about now. And again, really stinky, looking for those flies and beetles. And pawpaws and skunk cabbage also do another interesting thing. In addition to stinking and being really kind of gross and cool, they are successively male and female over the course of the spring. So pawpaws actually start out as female flowers and then turn into male flowers. Skunk cabbages, the literature kind of is conflicting about which comes first, but it can be either male or female and then switch to the other over the course of the spring. And then really, really my absolute favorite flowers are Jack in the Pulpit. So again, they have that really kind of rancid stink. And they're hoping for flies and beetles to come down into this tube. And they do something extra sneaky, which is that the female flowers don't allow the insects to escape, because once they have delivered their pollen, the flower doesn't have any more use for it. The male flowers, on the other hand, do want the insects to escape and then go on to pollinate a female flower. And so this picture, you can tell it is a male Jack in the Pulpit because there is a little hole at the base of that kind of column, which is where the insects, they will go down, they will pick up the pollen, that will be their only escape route, and they'll go throughout that hole and then hopefully go on and pollinate another Jack in the Pulpit. So go look for some of these flowers as they're coming up in the next couple of weeks. It's a very exciting time of year. And that is the fifth lesson that I think we can learn from plants, which is to be creative. They have innovated all sorts of different strategies for accomplishing that same goal of getting pollinated and getting their seeds out to disperse. It's really incredible. But not all flowers are still showy, and not all of them are still relying on insect partners. Some of them, like that white oak that I showed earlier, have very inconspicuous flowers. And that's because they have reverted to their wind-pollinated ways that gymnosperms have. So on the left are the flowers of a white oak tree. So white oak trees, they do in fact have flowers. This is what they look like. This is why they are so easy to overlook. They are not big and flashy and showy. They're just these little delicate dangles that are even hard to tell they're flowers even when you're looking at them in the hand. The alder catkins at Clifton are flowering right now. And again, they're very inconspicuous. They're just these little kind of yellow dangling tubes. If you jiggle one, you will get yellow pollen all over your finger, but otherwise it would be really hard to know that that is a flower. And that's because these guys are not attracting insects. They don't need to be big and beautiful and showy. They're just waiting for the wind to come and blow their pollen around. Another wind-pollinated flowering plant that has lost its big, beautiful petals is grasses. So Indian grass, for example, as shown here. We often don't think about grasses as having flowers, but they do. And this is what Indian grass flowers look like. These little dangling yellow anthers is all the flower they're gonna have, because again, they're not waiting for insect partners to come and pollinate them. And so I do want to emphasize the fact that grasses are flowering plants. They kind of fall in that category that people are not sure how they reproduce, but we can again think, are they mosses? Nope. Are they pine trees? Nope. Then they must be flowering plants, which indeed they are. And one of the reasons that I think we forget grasses are flowers is because we're used to the grasses in our lawns that kind of look just like grass all year round. But that's because we usually mow it before it has a chance to flower. And if we let it grow up, we would see flowers and then eventually seeds. And it's a good thing that grasses have seeds because we eat a lot of them. Some of the grass seeds that we consume include corn, wheat, rice, barley, really important food crops. So if grasses didn't have flowers, didn't make seeds, we would be out big, big food groups. And grasses have a really incredible superpower. But to get there, I need to introduce a little bit more of terminology. So plants kind of come in two categories, which are annual and perennial. So some plants complete their whole life cycle in a year and then die completely, and they rely on whatever seeds they have made and dispersed to start the next generation. So that is an annual life strategy. You do your whole life cycle in a year, die, and let the next generation take over. Perennial plants, on the other hand, live for more than a single year. They often fruit and flower each year, and then over the course of their life, they can create multiple generations of seeds before they eventually die. So they can live for many, many years instead of just one. And within the perennial plants, again, there are two categories, which are herbaceous and woody. So some plants that can live for multiple years appear to die back at the end of each growing season, while their roots stay alive underground. And those are the herbaceous plants. So a lot of the plants on the forest floor, a lot of grasses, they look like they have died, they look like they have disappeared, but their roots are just waiting for next year when they will grow a whole new set of leaves and flowers. Woody plants, on the other hand, are able to keep growing the same structure, building on the same structure year after year after year. And so grasses are in that herbaceous category, so they have roots that stay alive underground. In the winter, it looks like the grasses die back, but come spring, they're going to put out some new leaves and look very, very happy. Not only can they kind of die back and grow year to year, but an individual grass leaf has the very, very special ability to keep growing even if most of it is destroyed. And that is not true for most plants. So most plants, if you cut its leaf, that leaf is done for that season. Grasses, if you come and snip it, it will actually be able to regrow, kind of like a gecko regrowing its tail. And that means that a grass can be burned or grazed within the growing season almost indefinitely, and they will keep growing. Our thought is that grasses appeared about 55 million years ago, and they probably evolved this superpower because they were evolving around huge ancient herbivores like this rhinoceros that was found, I think, in Nebraska. And that is some of the oldest evidence of grasses that we have. We have fossil grass grains from inside the stomach of one of these incredible Miocene rhinoceroses. So again, this ability to kind of regrow their leaves even after they get cut is kind of a grass superpower. And eventually those rhinoceroses disappeared. They were replaced by things like these bison, who also really are thankful for the grass's ability to keep growing because they can come and graze the grass, wait a little while, and the grass will regrow from wherever they ate it. And this is why grass makes such a great food for livestock like cows, because we can put cows out in a field and they will eat down the grass leaves, and then those same individual grass leaves will just keep growing back even after they get grazed over and over and over again. And it also makes it a great plant to put in our lawns because, again, we can come through with a lawnmower over and over and over again and just keep cutting back the same grass leaves, and they will keep on growing. Woody plants are not so tolerant. They would probably die if they were grazed or burned. But if they are left alone, they can also keep on growing their whole lives. And that is very different than animals. Animals have a set period of time in our lives where we are able to grow. And then once that period is over, we are kind of stuck with whatever size we achieved. And we have physical constraints. So even if you fed a baby the most nutritious diet, it's not going to grow to be 10 feet tall. There are certain limits in our body of how big we can get. Woody plants can keep growing their whole life, and there aren't really hard constraints on how big they can get. So even this is the famous Methuselah tree, the oldest tree in the world. Maybe there's some competition, but even these oldest trees in the world are very, very, very slowly growing, even at the age of, I think, 4,800 years. They will keep growing even if it's very, very slow. And in particular, plants like this tree will grow from the top. I think sometimes we think about trees growing like hair that kind of shoots out from the bottom. Trees actually put out new growth from the top. And the way they do that is by this, I think, kind of underappreciated part of a plant, which is its buds. And this is a plant that as we're kind of wrapping up winter, this is a part of the plant rather, that as we're wrapping up winter, I think you should go out and kind of see all the different shapes and colors and types of buds that we can find around you. And this is the part of the plant that allows it to grow from the top and keep growing its whole life, because every year it can grow a new set of buds. And trees get ready for their spring growth way back last summer or fall. They are putting together little packets of baby leaves and seeds in this vast diversity of shapes and sizes, so that as soon as the spring weather hits, they are ready to explode with new growth. Okay, so I think that is the sixth lesson that we can learn from plants, is that we can always keep on growing. We can take a little inspiration from the plants around us, the trees and the grasses, and keep on growing and try again, even if we get cut down. So again, just to reiterate, many plants can be recovered from being cut back, but grasses especially have the superpower to grow back even when the same leaf is cut over and over again, and trees can keep on growing their whole lives. And there is a really incredible fact about how trees grow, which was discovered in an experiment by this scientist named Jan Baptist van Helmont back in about 1648. And he was curious how trees grow. Where does all the stuff of a tree come from? And he did an experiment on a willow tree, which is that he measured out 50 gallons of soil into a pot, very carefully measured all that soil, planted a willow seedling, and over the course of 5 years, watered that seedling and took care of it, but didn't add anything else besides water to that pot. And at the end of those 5 years, he took a much bigger willow tree out of the pot, very carefully brushed off all the soil from its roots, and collected all of the soil in the pot, and found almost exactly 50 gallons of soil. So over the course of 5 years, this teeny tiny willow seedling had grown into a sizable willow tree, and yet the amount of soil in the pot had not diminished at all. Now, from that experiment, he made the erroneous conclusion that the mass of the tree came from the water that he was adding. We now know that the mass of the tree came from the carbon in the carbon dioxide it was breathing in. So all of the mass of all of the trees that we can see around us, it's not coming from the soil, it's not coming from the water. They are turning the carbon dioxide molecules that animals are exhaling every second of our lives, and they're taking this ephemeral gas, rearranging the carbon, and forming the mass of their bodies. And so I think that's a really neat thing to think about, that as we are walking in the woods, inhaling the carbon dioxide from the trees and inhaling the oxygen from the trees and exhaling the carbon dioxide, we are giving the trees the raw material they need to keep growing. So that is the final lesson of the evening, that I think we can learn from trees, that to use what you've got. They make huge amounts of mass, huge amounts of wood out of thin air. Okay, so that is the 7 lessons I think we can learn from plants. So just to kind of run through the list again, the first lesson was to each their own. So plants have very different nutritional needs than animals, and mostly fulfill those needs completely on their own. We can get a little inspiration from teeny tiny mosses and think about small and steady wins the race, and think about how successful they've been as very small plants for a very long time. The third lesson was to invest wisely and to take inspiration from plants, provisioning their seeds with the nutrients they need to have a safe journey. It's okay to ask for help. That is the inspiration that we can get from flowering plants who learn to rely on animal pollinators. We can be creative and take inspiration from flowers' huge, vast diversity of different structures. We can think about always continuing to grow and continuing to try even after we get cut down, like the trees and the grasses do. And then finally, use what we've got. These trees make wood out of thin air, so surely we can do something almost as miraculous. And don't forget that fruits come from flowers. That is probably the most important botanical lesson of the night. I hope that gives a little bit more appreciation into plants. I hope you are inspired to maybe go out and look at plants a little bit differently. If you would like to continue learning and maybe developing your relationship with plants, as always, I think the best thing that you can do is to go out on a walk with somebody who knows a lot about plants, who loves plants. That could be here at Clifton, it could be with the Native Plant Society. Go find someone who knows about plants and learn from them. A great way to learn about plants is to try to figure out what it is. That could be with a dichotomous key, that could be with iNaturalist, but to try to learn the names of the plants around us is a great way to get to know this really special community. There are all sorts of hands-on ways we can learn to appreciate plants by collecting seeds and growing plants. And if you know me, you know that I will be a big proponent of doing something like nature journaling or keeping a phenology journal of a record of all the plants that we can find around us, because there is some incredible stuff going on. Okay, that is all I have for tonight. I am happy to take any other questions, and otherwise I appreciate you being here, appreciating plants with me. Thank you.